Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 5 from Joshua chapter 24. This is the last lesson from the book of Joshua. God deserves worship. We're working this title, though, Standing Before the Tree, the tree of the Garden of Eden. The test is issued once more because essentially that's what Joshua is doing here is inviting Israel to a fidelitous relationship with the Lord, but calling them out for the fact that they have refused to engage in such prior to this point, and now they have to make the choice between two different types of wisdom, sources of wisdom, practices of wisdom, much in the same way the two trees in the garden, that of life and the knowledge of good and evil, are two different forms of wisdom. So by this point, the pattern should be, I think, pretty appreciable as we're working from Genesis 3 on into the chapters of Joshua 23 and 24, where our host text is. So in Genesis 3, God said, "You must not eat or you will die." But the woman took the fruit and she ate it. We know what happens from there, right? Building from that pattern moving forward, we have Exodus chapters 20 through 32 with Israel approaching the Lord at Mount Sinai, and then all the way up to the moment when they are tested as Moses has been up on the mountain for 40 days and nights. And now these people approach Aaron and entice him to make the golden calf. So back in Exodus chapter 20, the Lord's words heard directly by Israel, not through the mouth of Moses. Do not have other gods before me. And 4 chapters later, after more law is given, they clearly say unanimously, we will all do what the Lord has commanded. But several chapters later, in chapter 32, we have a proclamation after Aaron has made the calf, set it in front of the people. Someone speaks up and says, Israel, these are your gods. A direct contradiction to what was agreed to here, and of course, what the Lord said earlier. So in Numbers 14, we have yet again another choice, because way back in Exodus chapter 3, and again, this is just predicated upon what has already been revealed to Abraham hundreds of years earlier in Genesis. I have come down to bring them to a good land. So Yahweh has promised through Moses and validated this with signs. In Numbers chapter 10, the Israelites depart from Sinai seemingly on good faith that they trust Yahweh is going to do this. Perhaps they thought he was just going to open up passage into the land and make this so easy they would literally have to do nothing, perhaps as they did while they were still residing in Egypt. But when they hear the report of the spies, they say, wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Choosing that as being better and defining that as being right in comparison to what Yahweh has said is good and right for them and what he is going to partner with them to do. Adam and Eve have the experiment set before them of partnering with God, ruling over all creation and serving as priests to guard, watch, and keep what he has shared with them and to bring his glory to the furthest extent of all creation, slowly ordering all creation like the garden is, but they think something is better and they choose that instead or in lieu of. So that brings us to Joshua chapter 23. Now, I'm sprinkling some judges in here, and we're not quite there yet, but I'm doing that just as a way of looking a little bit further into the future to see how this begins to break down. Joshua chapter 23, this is what is being told. I have allotted these remaining nations, which are an inheritance for Israel. But when we get to Judges chapter 2, this is how this pays off. You have not obeyed me. What have you done? So the context here, of course, is deeper than this. We have the angel of the Lord who goes up to Bochim and he addresses all the people, at least as many of them as travel with him, but a good representation of all the tribes. And he said, I made a covenant with you and said, I will not depart from it. But in that covenant, you were not to make covenants with the inhabitants of this land, and you are to smash their altars and destroy their gods, but you have not obeyed me. The same thing that the Lord asks to the woman in the garden when Adam spills the beans about the fact it wasn't his fault in his own eyes. It was this woman that you gave me. And then he looks to her. That is Yahweh, looks to her and says, what have you done? And the same thing with Cain and Abel after Cain kills Abel. And the Lord comes to Cain and says, what have you done? Now he's asking this in the entire nation of Israel. They have blatantly disobeyed the Lord. They have conquered much of the land, but they have refused to move forward in faith and engage in the smaller scale skirmishes that are going to allow them to dispossess the remaining inhabitants of the divided up tribal allotments. they still do not possess the faith that Caleb had. Caleb takes a small army and does what essentially Abraham did when he took a few more than 300 men and goes and challenges a coalition of 5 kings that came from the east across the Mesopotamian river valley to challenge these clans of giants in and around the Trans and Cisjordanian areas and decimate them, including the kingdoms of Sodom and Gomorrah, and take Lot off as a captive. He, in faith, goes and challenges these people and then reaps a great victory because Yahweh delivers these people into his hand. Caleb essentially does the same thing and claims this mountain for himself as his possession in the territory of Judah. But these other tribes will not do this. And before we even reach the end of chapter 1 of Judges, we mark off nearly half a dozen or more of these tribes: the Benjaminites, the half tribe of Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and the Danites, who all failed to dispossess those people who were currently living around the areas they were supposed to be infiltrating and, of course, possessing. So that's important because even though we are not yet at Judges by the time we reach Joshua 24, obviously, what we're seeing here is that Israel is clearly in the new provincial Eden. And Joshua has now done much of the heavy lifting, but he is old and he knows his time is coming soon. So, of course, years are passing by here. We don't know exactly how many, somewhere between 5 to 7 years from the time they cross into the land through the Jordan until Joshua disbands the army and allows the half tribe of Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad to go back across the Jordan and then inhabit the lands they had already conquered some years before and live out their remaining days in peace. We don't know how long these other tribes took before they eventually start moving out into those areas. What I mean by that is when we get into the opening verses of chapter 1 of Judges, we're told that as long as Joshua and that generation of elders lived, the people of Israel were faithful. That would make it sound like that they would have been all too willing to go and try to infiltrate and possess their land. Did they remain pent up around Gibeon, where the high place was and where the tabernacle was set up at the time? Or did they and then slowly move away from that area as Joshua and those elders died? Or did they start to do this rather immediately after Joshua disbanded the army? It's hard to make heads or tails of that. But in Joshua's farewell address, this is what he's telling them. Essentially, he's calling them out for the fact that they have refused to give up the gods that their ancestors worshipped in Egypt and while still in Mesopotamia. He's hearkening back to the days of course, Jacob and his 4 wives, namely Leah and Rachel, and the fact that Rachel had stolen her father's household gods and brought them with them. And then, of course, going back to the time when Abraham was still living in Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia, all the way up to the age of 75, and of course was an idol worshiper. By Joshua's own words, he was an idol worshiper. So, this is what Joshua tells them. This is the command to fear the Lord and worship him in sincerity and truth. And just like the previous generation there at Sinai said, we will do everything the Lord has said. They say, we will certainly not abandon the Lord and worship other gods. This is preposterous. Why would we ever do such a thing? We would never think to do that. But then this is what we are told in the indictment in the opening chapter, as part of the indictment in the opening chapters of Judges, that the Israelites indeed worshipped other gods, committing the same atrocities as their ancestors. But we must appreciate the moment for what it is in Joshua chapter 24 when he says, choose this day the God you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will worship the Lord. The test is offered. The wisdom that they seek after is going to be a choice that they have to all make individually and corporately as a nation. And of course, we have to treat this moment as though we don't quite know what's going to come next in the book of Judges, albeit I think it's appropriate to introduce some of that here to help our students understand why this choice is so important. So I hope that's helpful. We'll talk more about this come the time of the workshop. Thanks for listening.